Hi, we're Quentin Curious Volumes, and you're watching Quentin Curious Volumes. My name is James. Today I'm going to do my top 10, 10 books I liked from 2023, and one that is probably not worth your time. I wanted to keep it more on the positive side. I did read more good books than bad books, and while the one that I'm going to flag is maybe not the worst book I read, it's one that is probably the most likely to be of interest to someone like me. If you're watching this, you may have already uh, picked up and read this book. Anyway, let's get started. So, as I said earlier, I read through all of Shakespeare this past year. So, I'm going to make the extremely controversial declaration that my favorite Shakespeare play is Hamlet. Most people are going to pick Hamlet or Lear, and I'm picking Hamlet. It's not close for me. If I read Lear more, I may change my mind. Hamlet, I find, even though it's the longest, it's the one that kind of reads the quickest to me. I've read it the most times, so the familiarity might help. Um, it has a great pace, an intriguing plot. It's very funny in a lot of places, and of course, it's extremely dark. And if you have not read Hamlet, you will find yourself reading through it and saying, "Oh, that's where that comes from. Oh, that's where that comes from. Hey, that cliche is from here as well." Uh, Hamlet. Going out on a limb saying Hamlet is really good. I'm also going to say that Measure for Measure is really good as well. How about that? You know, I, like a lot of people, was not that familiar with the comedies. Had a sort of limited exposure. You know, they don't translate as well as the tragedies. But Measure for Measure kind of is very dark until the very end. And I think that there's someone who says aphoristically that the Shakespeare tragedies are comedies until the very end, and the comedies are tragedies until the very end. This one could well be that. The plot is based on a duke of a city who is concerned that his people are becoming too immoral. So he tells everyone he's going to leave, and he puts one of his underlings in charge. But he doesn't actually leave. He assumes the disguise of a monk, and well, you know Shakespeare. You know, someone puts on a disguise and no one can recognize him. So he's going around and seeing all the wicked things that his underling is doing in his absence. At one point, he tests someone by convincing her that her beloved brother has been beheaded for a crime he did not commit. Very strange stuff. But in the end, it turns out okay. Everyone's fine. So, yeah, Measure for Measure, an interesting one and worth a read. The Shakespeare comedies that I found least rewarding, I guess, Two Gentlemen of Verona, Winter's Tale. I kind of became impatient with that one, oddly enough. Okay, now I'm going to talk about a history, and a history that I think is worth your time is King Henry VI, Part 2. This play is nuts. It has, I mean, it's one of the um, War of the Roses plays, so it has a lot of minor noblemen and a lot of side switching, and in the middle of it, there is a rebellion that is started by one of King Henry's dukes while Henry goes off to fight a war in Ireland. Cade's rebellion. Cade's rebellion is crazy. Then Cade's rebellion gets put down when some noblemen go out to the revolting peasants and says, "Remember how great King Henry V was?" And they're like, "Yeah, he was good." And they're like, "Well, this guy's his son." And they're like, "Yeah." Yeah, Kay's rebellion stinks. We're giving up our rebellion. And then Cade himself gets killed while foraging for food. This book is nuts. Oh, and it also has Margaret walking around with her lover's head. It's very strange stuff. Anyway, consider reading King Henry VI Part 2. If you're doing that, you're probably reading all of the histories in order, but this one was really a wild ride. So, after Shakespeare, I also read all of Jane Austen, and I will say my favorite is Persuasion. Persuasion is, I think it's her last book. It has kind of a melancholiness to it. It has an older heroine who fell in love with a naval officer and was persuaded by one of her friends not to marry him. Years later, they are reacquainted. And does their love affair resume? Have you read Jane Austen? It won't be a surprise. But there are some surprising things that happen in it, including someone falling off of something to great dramatic effect. An unusual thing. Usually, a Jane Austen novel will have someone become briefly invalided by walking in the rain and getting wet. In this case, she sustains a concussion. But anyway, I don't think that's a spoiler. Anyway, spoiler alert for Persuasion by Jane Austen. Um, then moving on to the Victorians. I will say the best Victorian novel I read this year. Look, the hot takes are coming really fast and furious in this video, but Middlemarch is a great Victorian novel. I think it is close, in my estimation, to Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair was also a great Victorian novel that I read this year. Middlemarch, more psychologically sophisticated, certainly has this fascinating ethical knot in the plot towards the end of it, and the way that it gets resolved and untangled is very exciting. I guess you could say, but really, this is a slow moving novel about people with fully realized interior lives, and the way that George Eliot describes their thought processes as things are occurring. That's really the genius of it, in my estimation, on a first read. But Middlemarch, definitely a book for rereading, and I shall do that within the next few years, I hope. What's going to stand in for the best, I suppose, genre fiction, fantasy, sci-fi, mystery? I don't read a lot of those. But as I said, I am trying to read a little bit more fantasy. I think the best fantasy I read this year was Ursula K. Le Guin's A Wizard of Earthsea. This is a relatively short book, the first of a series. It's about Ged, who is at the beginning of it, a young man who has some talent in manipulating the magic of this world. He goes into a wizard school where he begins to learn how to harness this power. It's unusual for a fantasy novel in that it doesn't have a lot of war, it does not have a lot of violence. There is some, but it's mostly about this magical system and the price that Ged pays for abusing his power at a certain point. And that comes back to haunt him later in the story. So, Wizard of Earthsea, a good read. I have it in this old mass market paperback, and I did read it in this format, and this could be read a couple more times, I think, without falling apart. It also has some really cool illustrations and maps, which are helpful because there's a lot of sailing around in this book. So those are the novels that I have on my list. I'm going to say my favorite book of poetry this year was Elizabeth Bishop's Complete Poems. I read this as an accompaniment to the Steve Tiberius Donahue Book Club, where we were reading the letters of Elizabeth Bishop. I did not finish the letters of Elizabeth Bishop. I did finish her poetry, and it was fantastic. I will read to you one of them, a relatively short one called Insomnia. The moon in the bureau mirror looks out a million miles, and perhaps with pride at herself, but she never, never smiles. Far and away beyond sleep, or perhaps she's a daytime sleeper. By the universe diverted, she'd tell it to go to hell, and she'd find a body of water or a mirror on which to dwell. So wrap up care in a cobweb and drop it down the well, into the world inverted, where left is always right, where the shadows are really the body, where we stay awake all night, where the heavens are shallow as the sea is now deep and you love me. Insomnia by Elizabeth Bishop from The Complete Poems of Elizabeth Bishop. My favorite book of poetry of the year. The best history book that I read this year was also part of the Steve Tiberius Donahue Book Club. It was Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror. This is a history of the 14th century in Europe, mainly centered on northern France and England, though Italy is involved, or the region of Italy and the Holy Roman Empire. If there were a sequel to this, a slightly less distant mirror, history of the 15th century in Europe, I would be all over that. This book is great, and I wish that it was longer. The calamitous 14th century, holy wars, regular wars, crusades, plague, all kinds of terrible stuff happened in the 14th century in Europe. These history books, they will cure you of any romantic desire to live in a different time. One of the things we don't even think about when you imagine the knights in shining armor, that these guys, when they didn't have wars to fight, would just sort of form into companies and just show up and basically be land pirates and just take what they wanted from people, and there was nothing they could do about it. Anyway, most people, would we have been the knights or would we have been the peasants at their mercy? Okay, the best autobiography memoir that I read this year was Experience by the late Martin Amis. When I was in my 20s, I was a big fan of Martin Amis. His big fat novels like The Information and London Fields were coming out then. I loved the Martin Amis novels. I did not read all of them, but I read a lot of them. And he was just seemed the coolest guy in the 90s to me. I did not keep up with him for long, but when he passed, I had this book on my shelf, and I said, well, let me read this. And it is wonderful. It's complicated and it's frustrating, and it has footnotes all over the place. And in some ways, it deals with unusual topics for a memoir. In fact, it kind of centers around he keeps returning to these two strands in his life. One is the murder of his cousin, which apparently was a fairly well-known crime in England at the time, and his own dental problems. As someone who has some dental problems of my own, I could really relate to that. So Martin Amis's Experience, really a beautiful, powerful memoir. Martin Amis is a real stylist, as they say. So if you want prose pyrotechnics, this is a great one for that. The best music book that I read this year was Well of Souls by Christina R. Gaddy. This is a history of the banjo, or an exploration of an early part of banjo history. A lot of people have written books exploring the African and Caribbean roots of the instrument we call the banjo. Christina Gaddy had access to some new information on this, brings some new archives to light. She is able to read and explore Dutch archives, so the Dutch colonial aspects of the banjo's history are something that I don't think I've seen written about in any other banjo histories or by other banjo scholars. So that was well done. There are also some things that were totally new to me in here, such as the tradition of diorama. So there are some dioramas, I believe from Suriname, somewhere in the Caribbean, dioramas made by a gentleman of African descent that depict banjos and amidst street scenes and other celebrations. Really fascinating stuff. So Christina R. Gaddy's Well of Souls, uncovering the banjo's hidden history. The best music book I read this year. And now the worst book I read this year, or at least the one that I'm saying is least worth your time and that you are most likely to possibly be interested in. This is someone who I have a great deal of respect for, and I will continue to have a great deal of respect for, but this book was not worth it. The Philosophy of Modern Song by Bob Dylan, Nobel laureate Bob Dylan. One of my personal heroes, Bob Dylan, wrote this book to get people like me to fork over $30. It's about all I can say about it. This is not a philosophy. It is not about modern song. It is basically a Spotify playlist with some vague ramblings attached to it. I learned about some songs I had not heard of that was kept it from being a total wash. But this thing is just chock-a-block with one cliche after another. And I don't think he even wrote it. I think he listened to a song, yammered into a tape recorder for about 10 minutes, and then a couple of days later, when he listened to another song that he thought would fit, he yammered into a tape recorder for a couple of minutes, and after a few weeks of this, he's got a manuscript. No thanks. Anyway, those are my picks and my anti-pick for 2023. I will be back later this week. I think I'm going to do the university tag. Thanks to everyone who is subscribed and who's been commenting. It's been a lot of fun. I will talk to you later. Thank you, BookTube.